You're watching Scriptease. In today's episode, we'll be discussing how to make your protagonist likable by looking at the film Catch Me If You Can. You can expect spoilers for the whole film. All characters should be relatable, but that doesn't mean that every character needs to be likable. If you're at all interested in storytelling, you've most likely heard 1,000 times that characters need to be relatable. It's important that the audience can understand the guiding motivations behind a character's actions so that we can place ourselves in their shoes. But just because a character is relatable, that doesn't mean that we have to like them. We can understand why Claude Frollo's inability to indulge his love drives him to kill Esmeralda, but he's selfish and weak-willed. We can understand how Snape's jealousy and history of bullying makes him resent Harry, but for the first few books he is, undoubtedly, a jackass. Alex Forrest's motivation is dead simple to understand. She fell in love. But it's the obsessive extreme of this love that's so disagreeable. But of course, none of these examples are protagonists. So the question is, does the protagonist have to be likable? No, of course not. There are plenty of unlikable protagonists. Take Fatal Attraction, for example. Dan Gallagher may redeem himself as a family man to some degree, but we open with him having an affair. He's a cheater and a liar. He's patently unlikable. But what's worse than a cheater and a liar? A crazy lady who stews pet rabbits. And so we want Dan Gallagher and his family to escape Alex Forrest's obsession. So maybe the protagonist doesn't have to be likable. But we spend the whole film following the protagonist as they try to achieve their goal, so we certainly need to be able to root for them. Last episode I mentioned a quote from Alfred Hitchcock. The apprehension of the bomb is more powerful than the feelings of sympathy or dislike for the characters involved. But Hitchcock also makes this concession. Of course, when the character is attractive, as for instance Grace Kelly in Rear Window, the public's emotion is greatly intensified. He uses the word attractive in this specific case, but I feel it's not too much of a stretch to broaden this idea and say that the more that we like a character, the more invested we are in their well-being. So no, a protagonist doesn't have to be likable, but it certainly helps, and that's why today we'll be looking at some ways to make your protagonist likable. Now, there's a lot of overlap between what makes a character relatable and what makes them likable, so let's start with a quick summary of what makes a character relatable first. The key to making a character relatable is providing them with a strong external motivation which is in direct conflict with an internal flaw. The audience empathizes with the character as they struggle to realize their flaw and either overcome it or succumb to it. Importantly, you need to ground the character's specific problem in some more common truth that all people can relate to. Let's take the example of Finding Nemo. Marlin's external goal is to save Nemo. He wants to do this because he wants to protect Nemo from danger. The reason he's so scared of losing Nemo is because he lost his wife and his other children. This trauma forms the basis for Marlin's flaw. He's overprotective of Nemo and won't let him take any risks. In the third act, Marlin trusts Nemo to take a risk so that he can save Dory, thus overcoming his flaw. The audience for this film is parents taking their kids to the movies, so therefore we can expect the parents to relate to Marlin's fear of losing a child, and the kids to relate to being overly controlled by their parents. Plus, the bright colors and cute fish. Now on top of this firm basis of relatability, we add on the 3 key traits of likability. The first trait is that a likable person is good at what they do. Think of Tallahassee from Zombieland, who rips through zombies with ease, or Sully from Monsters Inc., who's the top scarer at the factory. The second trait is that a likable person has something they're passionate about. I said earlier that a relatable person has a goal, but a likable person is so thoroughly emotionally invested in their goal that they struggle to live without it. Tallahassee loves and misses his son, and so he searches Zombieland for small moments of joy to remind him that life is still worth living. Sully cares about Boo and wants to protect her with his life. The final trait is that a likable person is charming. Now that doesn't have to be romantically charming, it could be, but merely that they have some trait which attracts other people. They could be funny, cool, sexy, cute, etc. Tallahassee is folksy and laid back. Sully is fluffy and good-humoured. Now I'll admit that this final trait is quite broad, but it becomes fairly obvious when you look at non-likable characters and realize that they have almost no redeemable qualities. What charm does Claude Frollo have? Or Voldemort? Or Alex Forrest? None. They're insane, domineering, and obsessive. The problem for storytellers is that many interesting people aren't very likable. What if we want to tell a story about a corrupt politician, or a serial killer? How can we make characters like this the protagonist, while still making the audience want to root for them? Catch Me If You Can follows the story of an impersonator and counterfeiter called Frank Abagnale. The real-life Frank Abagnale posed as a series of white-collar professions, all while stealing money from not only the banks, but the bank's customers as well. While posing as a pilot, Frank would sometimes be left in control of the aircraft, taking the lives of the passengers on board in his hands should the autopilot fail. In the most disconcerting of his roles, Frank was appointed as a pediatrician with no real qualifications whatsoever. He only gave up the act when an oxygen-deprived baby almost died under his watch. From this description alone, it would be hard to say that Frank is a likable person. He's a selfish and manipulative fraud and thief. But of course, if you've seen the film, the last thing you are probably thinking about is how much of an asshole this guy really is. That's because screenwriter Jeff Nathanson and director Stephen Spielberg go to great lengths to accentuate the relatable and likable qualities of Frank's character. As defined before, for Frank to be relatable, he needs a strong external motivation which is in direct conflict with his internal flaw. Frank's motivation for much of the film is to avoid capture by the FBI. Yet he keeps committing crimes, not only because he loves the luxuries that it affords him, but because he loves the reputation he attains when he impersonates pilots and doctors. In truth, this is his real motivation. He wants to be accepted by people. This need for acceptance stems from his parents' divorce, which he interpreted as rejection, but he's unable to be accepted by any of the people he meets during his cons because their relationships are built on lies. He blatantly lies like a child, he commits crimes for attention, and he refuses to accept responsibility for his actions. This is Frank's internal flaw, his lack of maturity. In the third act, Frank is finally captured, and with the death of his father and seeing that his mother has moved on, he can no longer cling to the past. When Frank makes one last attempt to flee, the FBI agent that has been chasing him all this time, the last outlet of attention that Frank was receiving, tells him this.
Nobody's chasing you.
If Frank wants acceptance, he won't get it by acting like a kid anymore. By returning to the FBI of his own volition, Frank finally overcomes his flaw and matures. So that's how Frank is relatable, but that still doesn't explain how he's likable. I could take the exact same story I just relayed above, and Frank still comes off as an irresponsible child with no regard for other people's well-being that we're supposed to forgive just because he felt unloved when his parents got divorced. Let's be honest here, it's a pretty weak motivation for an international crime spree. But Frank's likability is all about how the story is framed. Firstly, we can see that Frank is clearly good at what he does, even if what he does is illegal. As a counterfeiter, we constantly hear from the FBI how Frank is reinventing the counterfeiting game. Near the end, the FBI even confirms he's making real checks, while in the film there's an added scene of professional printers admiring his handiwork. We see Frank's attention to detail a couple of times throughout the film. At the start, Frank notices that the student's note from their parents isn't creased, and uses deductive reasoning to explain why it should have been folded in half. Then towards the end of the film, while in jail, Frank intricately describes a forged check to the FBI. Frank's attention to detail also goes a long way in his role as an impersonator, whether that's forging credentials or picking up the jargon of pilots to make his act more convincing, as in this scene.
What kind of equipment you on, DC-8?
707.
You turning around on the red eye?
I'm jumping puddles for the next few months trying to earn my keep running leapfrogs for the weak and weary.
No shame in that. We all did it.
Secondly, Frank has something that he's passionate about. For the bulk of the film, this is his parents, in particular his dad. His father was something of a con man himself, and so Frank attempts to earn his respect by following in his footsteps. He also, well-meaningly, attempts to give his stolen wealth to his dad to support him. But this part of the story is entirely fabricated. The real Frank never saw his dad again after running away from home. We also get invested in Frank's love for Brenda, which seems for all the world to be genuine. When she folds under pressure from the FBI, he's shattered. This character is also a fabrication. The real Frank was never engaged to anyone at that time. But Nathanson includes these two relationships to show that Frank has people he's passionate about and wants to impress all the way through the film. Once again, the desire to be loved is a universal truth that endears Frank to the audience. Lastly, Frank has plenty of charm. The main way this comes across is in his charisma. He's a smooth talker. Multiple times throughout the film, Frank talks his way out of a bad situation. Like when the FBI first finds him and he pretends to be working for the Secret Service, using bravado to bust his way out. More commonly though, we see Frank using his charm on ladies, either to get them interested in him or to get something he wants from them, like the bank teller or the flight attendant. In the case of Brenda, he starts by simply using her, captivating her with his words, but soon falls in love with her. Frank's natural charisma is boosted by the status his roles allow him. Being a doctor, lawyer, or, in particular, a pilot greatly enhances Frank's reputation and makes him seem far cooler than he really is. This is exemplified in the sequence where he disguises college girls as flight attendants to hide his entry into the Miami airport. Every single guy in the airport looks his way. They all want to be him. And this doesn't just work on the other people in the film, it works on the audience as well. Seeing an attractive guy like Leonardo DiCaprio as a doctor, pilot, or lawyer, well, it just makes sense that he can get whatever he wants. In real life, Frank Abagnale wasn't particularly attractive. In fact, the reason he was able to get away with most of his impersonations was that even at a young age, he was starting to get grey hair. Now that's not to say that attractive people are always more likable, but, well, you can read the articles yourself. In particular, there's a psychological phenomenon known as the Patzer effect, which suggests that physically attractive speakers come across as more expert and trustworthy than their non-attractive counterparts. Ouch. Overall though, Nathanson and Spielberg rely on one big trick to really alter our perception of Frank. More than his skill at counterfeiting, more than his love for his parents, and more than his charisma, the biggest emphasis is placed on the fact that, despite all of this, Frank is just a kid. Throughout the film, we get little touches of Frank's childish nature shining through. When he becomes a doctor, he takes role like at school. When he takes his first flight, he nervously asks,
Milk?
and of course, when he loses his virginity, he still seems like a kid when he says,
This is by far the best date I have ever been on.
This effect is bolstered by the start of the film, in which we first see Frank in prison. Knowing that he'll get his comeuppance, the audience no longer has to worry about whether the FBI will stop this criminal. His criminal acts turn from malicious to mischievous. Frank goes from scoundrel to scamp.
I would have probably never done it, but because I was a kid, I had this kid's imagination that I can do anything, I can get away with anything, or at least I'm willing to try it, and had no fear of consequences. So in my case, it wasn't that I was brilliant or that I was a genius. I think it was more about the fact that I was very young, and I looked at it through the eyes of a kid than the eyes of an adult.
It was the naivety of youth.
Right, yes.
A good excuse.
Yeah.
Despite the crimes that Frank commits, Nathanson and Spielberg make us root for him anyway. Maybe we don't want him to escape, but we certainly don't want to see him suffer. We want him to redeem himself, to learn from his mistakes. By painting Frank as a child, and portraying his crimes as simple misadventures on his path to maturity, the audience views Frank not as a fraud, but as a misguided child. Making your protagonist likable strengthens the bond the audience has with them and makes the outcome of their story all the more rewarding. Next time you're creating a protagonist, think about what will make the audience enjoy watching them succeed. Good writing and good luck.